Yeah, I think that's a sensible way to do it. So you're going to I need to just get clear about what we're doing. So we'll start with Dan proposing a question to Greg, and then we'll allow Greg to see whether he has a question.
Would that work okay? I have to say Greg's a lot more congenial than George Pell. Do you know who George Pell is? I debated him Thursday, and before the debate we agreed to take a photograph. Afterwards we'd have a photograph of the event, but after the debate was over he said, "I don't want my photo taken with you," and he walked away. I hope we take him.
Was that because you used the Thor argument on him?
I forget what I said. I think he was not that upset that I would criticize God, but when I criticized Mother Teresa, that was like. Okay, so my first question to you is, remembering what I said earlier, okay, about human nature, exaggerating, misinterpreting, making mistakes, even sometimes telling lies. That we all know that's a part of human nature, right? We're easy to see it in others. What made the early Christians exempt? Weren't they just human beings, or were they somehow these superhuman cartoon guys who never made mistakes? What made them exempt from error?
I'll say something here that not everyone who is a Christian in the room probably believes, is that I don't think they were exempt from error. I just think they were largely incredibly reliable in what they wrote. So I'm happy for there to be versions of stories in the Bible, in the New Testament, that are different from each other in small details, because it actually enhances for me the likelihood that it's real history, because that's how people write real history. So your argument is about myth-making doesn't work for me, because the Gospels don't look like myths, and this is what made C.S. Lewis become a believer, because he knew mythology as a professor of medieval literature. He knew mythology. He loved the Norse myths as a kid, and this didn't look like myth. It looked like history. And part of that, and I stand with C.S. Lewis on this, was to recognise that the tiny factual kind of variants and things that you find actually enhance the value of the Gospels as history.
Can you give us an example of one of those errors or variants?
No, I'm not very good at doing that, actually. You probably can, because you've studied them. I'm never good at pulling out the stories and remembering the dates and the times and so forth, unless I've got the book in front of me. But go for it.
No, I'm not going to go for it. You said that they were human beings who would make mistakes and have errors, so I just wondered if you would support that in some way. But I'm not...
No. There are small errors of perspective.
What is one of those?
Etc. Like the number of angels that are there at the resurrection appearance. Okay. Now, there are all sorts of ways of matching up the Gospels, but I don't do that, because, it looks like special pleading, right? I'm happy with the view that this is how they wrote their history, this is what they remembered, this is what they had in their tradition. And there were angels there that they witnessed. That's the story, okay? So one saw one, one saw two, one saw three, whatever. They're the details that enhance for me the likelihood that this is real reporting. It's certainly not making up myths. You've got to have it one way or the other. It's either myth-making or it's actually history with all of the complications of writing actual history.
So the fact that the different gospel reporters report that there may have been one or two men or one or two angels sitting and standing in different places, saying different messages to a different number of women at a different time of day, this doesn't cause any bit of a wrinkle in your mind that there might be a problem with the reliability of at least one of those writers?
No, because I didn't have a fundamentalist kind of upbringing where you had to match up every little bit in the story to think it was robust. I really think Christianity is incredibly historically robust, and that you are really out on a limb among historians to suggest that there's even doubt about Jesus' existence, for example. But most historians have strong respect for the majority of the details, especially in the Gospel of Luke, which they take as the one with the most historical perspective. And those little things that you mentioned, and you might like to bring up other ones, but don't stand in the way of the robustness of the Jesus story handed down.
When you say that the New Testament does not show the signs of the footprints of myth compared to others, how can you say that after the numerous examples that I gave of pre-existing pagan mythology that pretty much says the same thing about living people as well as mythical people, and in light of the fact that early Christians like Justin Martyr agreed that there was no difference between the teachings of Christianity and pagan mythology, and later Christian writers like Ferguson cannot point to one single historical claim within the New Testament that's unique and different from all these pre-existing pagan ideas. How can you say that Christianity does not look like myth when it looks like myth?
Yeah, I find the Ferguson comment strange, and I'm going to go back and have a look at that in its context to see that what you said there is actually the result of his study.
The very last page of it.
Yeah, because when you read it, it sounded like a different kind of conclusion to me. But the myths of the ancient world don't match up to the Jesus story, except in some kind of attractive parallel aspects of the divine, if I can put it that way, like ideas about God, a man God, and that sort of thing. I don't know whether people here watch the movie Zeitgeist on the internet, which makes this big claim, similar to Dan's claim actually, about the mythical character of Christianity. The fellow you're debating tomorrow night at Macquarie, Chris Forbes, is an expert in this particular field, and has convinced me that actually the idea of a sun god being the background for the Son of God is completely ridiculous and doesn't match up to the story at all. I think it's a surface level impression, because you can say to people, look, it looks like myth, it must be myth. But it doesn't stand up to the close analysis of the myths. The way the Gospel of Luke is written has nothing to do with myth. Matthew is written in reference, as you know, to the prophecies of the Old Testament. That's its context. Mark is a fascinating Gospel because of its abrupt ending and its brevity of detail. But the myth-telling that you mentioned is just not there.
Greg, would you like to ask Dan a question? The other way around.
My first, perhaps, is just to say, do you concede that you're out on a limb in terms of your view of whether Jesus is a historical figure?
To be reasonable is not to be out on a limb. If you define out on a limb as being in a minority, then every Christian denomination is out on a limb. They're all different from the majority of scholars. If you take all the scholars of Christianity, every particular Christian denomination represented here is out on a limb. So that's kind of a pejorative way of saying it. I do agree that at the current time, the number of true mythicists, as opposed to scholars who subscribe to legend over myth, is relatively small, but it's growing. There are many, many more scholars now coming to that. Robert Price is one, and I can think of Richard Carrier and a number of others, who they're not saying you can disprove Jesus. What they're saying is the likelihood for the historical Jesus is dropping. That's what they're saying, and that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying you can disprove Jesus, that the whole thing was fabricated out of myth, although it sure looks like it a lot of times when you see that the amazing parallels, water into wine, and exorcisms, and walking on water, and stilling the storm, and all the miracles that Jesus did in the New Testament had been claimed to have been done by others. So it looks like myth, but I'm not saying Jesus never existed. And in fact, I kind of agree with you that the Son of God hypothesis is one of the lower ones, and I never even used that. There are better ways to do it than to compare it to Isis and Horus. I mean, that's powerful, all right? You can see some, correlation there, but there are much better ways to do that. And I could have listed many, many more examples. You talk about Mark. The scholar John MacDonald, shows that there are numerous stories in the Gospel of Mark, the first Gospel. Mark, by the way, was familiar with Homer. He read Homer. He used a lot of his words. Any educated writer of that century read Homer. They knew the stories of the Odyssey. You can take stories in the Gospel, if I wish I had time, you can take stories in the Gospel of Mark and compare them almost word for word with stories in Homer's Odyssey and Iliad and some of his other poetry. You can see the exact kinds of words, but he changes it, like the Three Little Pigs story. He'll change it to say, but my story is better. He'll put a twist to it. He was a literary genius in how he took previous material, writing from Homer, and then he adapted it for his gospel. Maybe there was a Jesus character that he was writing about, but in his literary approach to writing, he made Jesus into this kind of Homeric epic figure who did a lot of mythical ideas, mythical things.
Another question. It's now fairly well established among an aspect of New Testament scholarship that the worship of Jesus as God began very early. In fact, I got to see an inscription, a mosaic in Megiddo, Armageddon in Israel, with the words that we worship Jesus the God here. That's been dated rather early now.
What was the date?
That's end of the 2nd century. Yeah, so very early for archaeological discovery. Yeah.
Like 150 years.
Yeah, and up in Megiddo, so not in Jerusalem, so the faith had spread to there. So my question for you is, what accounts for the very early worship of Jesus among monotheistic Jews for whom there was only one God?
When Caesar Augustus died, Alexander the Great died, about 30 years after his death, he was being claimed to have been a God figure who came to save the world. People were worshipping. I know, but I'm pointing out to you that Christianity is not unique in that sense. 150 years later, you find somebody worshipping Jesus as God. In fact, you'll find a lot of word for word, with Caesar Augustus, you'll find a lot of word for word adoration of this man who supposedly, he was a human being, right? But then he was believed to have been born of a God after he had his big military victories. You know how the lionization and the making heroes out of these figures happens. They become gods later, right? Well, the same thing could have happened with Jesus, right? That his followers came later. There were Jews reported in the New Testament who believed that Jesus was the resurrection of John the Baptist. They believed that. They had a belief in this kind of idea. But it was not a scandalous idea to think that an earlier human being who had died had become resurrected in some way. So it is very simplistic to try to paint the early Jews as all having the same ideas about resurrection or the same ideas about monotheism and all that. It is true that early Christians did believe that Jesus was the Son of God. There's no doubt about that. Just like many Muslims believe that Muhammad was inspired by God. I mean, there's historical evidence that believers believed those things. That doesn't mean those things are therefore true.
So I want to try the same question again because it's a slightly different angle I'm saying. The Jews taught that you shall have no other God but me. It was it's the highest commandment, right? But what accounts for, as you admit, the early worship of Jesus as a God among people for whom, if he wasn't God, that is a blasphemy?
Yeah, because the early Christians were not polytheistic. They considered Jesus to be God, that he was the Son of God, and he said, I and my Father are one. So in the minds of the early Christians, they were not violating monotheism. By the way, this is on the side, but if monotheism is an improvement over polytheism, then what's the next logical improvement? I'm sorry, that was a bad joke, but atheism, of course, is much more logical, much more sensible. The whole idea that these polytheistic gods were not needed, and no longer is this monotheistic God. The Jews did not invent monotheism, by the way. They most likely borrowed it from the Egyptians, which gave rise to this whole idea that we must have lived in Egypt at a certain time when there's no archaeological historical evidence for any of those Egyptian stories like the crossing of the Red Sea or Egyptian captivity. Those are later myths, and many scholars are convinced that a lot of these later Jewish writers, writing centuries or millennia later, got their facts wrong, but they didn't care because none of their readers were going to check their facts. We know that happened. And the same thing happened with early Christianity. They knew their readers weren't going to... Paul knew that the people in Corinth, 25 years later, more than 1,000 miles away, were not going to check any of that stuff. And by the way, I admit this is a little bit off, but the language of 1 Corinthians 15 is a formulaic, kind of ritualistic language. Yeah, that hymn, that part that Paul supposedly is repeating. And a lot of Christian scholars suggest that the reason we should take the New Testament as historical is because it is not written in legendary style. It's written like real history. And yet the earliest document we have attesting to the resurrection is written in a legendary, mythical, kind of formulaic style. If it counts for the historicity of Jesus, that the rest of the New Testament does seem to be more narrative, then this form of 1 Corinthians 15 should count against the historicity of the very earliest account of the resurrection.
Okay, we have time just for one question from each of you for each other. So Dan, if you want to ask one final question.